The door slammed shut. Mirko's hand was still on the bolt when the first knock came. 3 blows, the knuckle-heavy kind that guards use when they already know you're in there. He didn't move. The bolt was cold under his fingers, iron worn smooth from years of use, and he focused on that. The texture of the metal, the way it sat in the bracket. Not on the 3 figures standing behind him in the shadow of the workshop. He heard them. He hadn't turned around yet, but he'd seen enough in the 2 seconds before he crossed the room. Dark silhouettes in the doorway, green skin catching the white heat of midsummer. 3 of them, one tall and still, one with a hand already moving toward her belt, one small enough that she'd barely filled the frame. He'd closed the door anyway. "Potter." The guard's voice came through the wood, flat and uninterested. "Open up. We're looking for orcs. They were run out of the market, and someone saw them come this way." Mirko sat back down at the wheel. The clay was still wet, the shape half-finished. A low, wide-mouthed jar for someone's kitchen. He set his hands to it. "Haven't seen anyone." His voice came out even, not because he was a skilled liar, but because he'd had years of practice saying true things in a tone that didn't invite argument. He hadn't seen anyone. He'd closed the door before he looked. A pause. Another knock. Harder. A test. "You sure? We can come in and check." "The workshop's mine," Mirko said. The wheel turned under his hands. "And I'm working." He pressed his thumbs into the clay, opening the base of the jar. The wall was thin but even. "Come back with papers from the council if you want to look around. Otherwise, I'll see you at market day." He heard the guards talk between themselves, 2 of them by the sound of it. One said something short. The other laughed, not kindly. Then boots on gravel, moving away. And then nothing but the creak of the wheel and the dry press of his own breathing. Mirko kept working for another full minute before he turned around. The 3 of them were still where he'd last not looked at them. The tall one, shaved head, burn scar along her left arm, a leather case strapped over one shoulder, stood at the wall nearest the door. Her hand wasn't on her belt anymore, but her posture said she'd put it there fast if she needed to. The middle one was built differently, wide through the shoulder, amber eyes tracking the room with the quick, deliberate attention of someone who'd learned to count exits early. The youngest was smaller than he'd expected, with a long braid and fingers, long, thin fingers, already resting near the edge of the shelf beside her, where half-finished pieces sat drying in the heat. The middle one spoke first. "Why?" Not a question exactly, more like the opening move of an argument she expected to win. Mirko looked at her. "Because 4 years ago, someone said I took something that wasn't mine," he said. "I didn't. The town believed it anyway. I stayed and worked and waited. And eventually people got tired of the story." He glanced at the bolt. "I know what it's like to have a door closed in your face." She watched him with the kind of attention that was looking for the lie in it. He let her look. There was no lie. That was the whole of it. The youngest had stopped looking at the shelf and was watching him now, too. Her light amber eyes, almost gold in the workshop's dusty light, moved from his face to the clay on the wheel to his hands and back. Her fingers were still near the clay pieces, not touching, hovering. "Go ahead," Mirko said. He nodded toward the unfinished bowl she'd been almost touching. "It's just drying." "It won't break." She looked at the tall one. The tall one said nothing. She didn't nod either. She just held still, which seemed to mean something to the younger girl, because the girl's fingers settled on the rim of the clay bowl, and she began, slowly, to trace the curve of it. Not testing for cracks, not evaluating, just feeling the shape. Mirko turned back to the wheel. The tall one, the oldest, didn't move away from the wall. She stood the way people stand when they're giving themselves permission to leave at any moment. One hand rested near the bronze chain at her neck, touching the triangular plate there, not fidgeting, just resting, the way a hand finds something familiar when the rest of the body is making decisions. She looked at the bolt on the door. She looked at him. She didn't say anything. The air in the workshop was thick with midsummer heat. The kiln in the yard had been cold since morning. Mirko had a batch ready to fire, but he'd been waiting on the weather, waiting for the late afternoon wind to shift the smoke away from the residential side. The big windows along the south wall were open, and the light that came through was white and flat and hard. It pressed down on everything. On the wheel, the jar was taking shape. Mirko kept his hands moving, heel pressure on the outside, thumbs lifting the inner wall, and let the silence do what it needed to do. He'd learned that about silence a long time ago. People who were afraid of it filled it with noise. People who had something to prove filled it with words. He had neither the fear nor the point. The wheel turned. The clay rose. The youngest girl had found a small knot of unused clay on the edge of the secondary table. Scraps left over from the morning, still workable. She'd pulled it toward her without asking. Her fingers were already pressing it, not shaping, just pressing, feeling the give of it. Mirko watched from the corner of his eye. She wasn't asking permission because she expected to be told no. Not because she felt at home. There was a difference. He knew that difference. He said nothing. The middle sister's eyes moved to the clay in the youngest one's hands. Something shifted in her expression. Not softness, exactly. More like recognition. The look of seeing something you've seen 100 times and are still not quite tired of. Then her jaw set again. She looked back at Mirko. "You said, you know what it's like." Her voice was flat. "That doesn't explain why you opened the door in the first place." Mirko lifted his hands from the clay, took a breath, set them back. "I didn't open it. I just didn't close it fast enough." He glanced at the bolt, cold iron, already wearing smooth in a new place from tonight. "There's a difference." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. At the wall, the oldest was still standing, still watching, one hand still at the bronze plate. She hadn't moved since the guard's footsteps left the gravel, and she still didn't move now. But something in the angle of her shoulders had shifted. Barely. Not toward comfort, just toward something that wasn't quite ready to leave yet. Outside, the sun was pressing the heat down into the stones of the yard. The air over the cold kiln shimmered in the distance. Somewhere in the town, behind the gate, a cart was moving over cobblestones, the sound small and far. Some things you can't do because they're smart. You do them because you've stood on the other side of the door before, and you remember what the wood felt like when it didn't open. Mirko's jar took shape on the wheel. The clay held. An hour passed the way hot hours pass in a workshop, slowly, thick with the smell of wet clay and stone dust. Nobody spoke much. The youngest, Nilka, had worked the scrap clay into a rough ball, and then into a flattened disc, and then into something that wasn't quite a bowl and wasn't quite not one either. The middle sister, Aska, had moved twice, once to the window, once to the far shelf where the finished pieces stood in rows, and both times she'd moved back to standing without touching anything. The oldest, Zuna, hadn't moved at all. When the hour was close to done, Aska said, "We should go." It wasn't aimed at Mirko. It was aimed at the room, the way you aim something at a room when you've already made a decision, and you want the walls to agree with you. Mirko was washing his hands at the basin in the corner. The clay came off in gray ribbons running down between his fingers, swirling in the water. He dried his hands on a cloth kept on the hook beside it. Old linen, stiff from years of use, and turned around. "I've got work," he said. He kept his voice the way he kept his wheel speed. Steady, not fast, not slow. "More than I can finish before the fall market." He looked at Aska, then at Zuna by the wall. "I pay in coin. Not much, but it's honest weight. You'd have a place to sleep. The house next door is mine. Empty room." Aska looked at him the way she'd been looking at him all hour, trying to find the angle, the thing he wanted, the shape of the debt he was building. "We don't take charity." "It's not charity," Mirko said. "I need hands. You need work. That's a trade." She was quiet. He could see the calculation in her. Not distrust of him exactly, but distrust of the situation, of anything that arrived this easily. He recognized that, too. Easy things had a way of being expensive later. "One night," she said finally. "We'll see." Mirko nodded. That was enough. Zuna moved then, the first time since the guards had left. Not toward him, not toward Aska. Toward the far end of the workshop where the kiln door stood open, the heavy iron hinge visible from across the room. She walked the length of the space without hurrying, her boots quiet on the stone floor, the leather case over her shoulder shifting with the movement. She stopped in front of the kiln door and looked at it. Not casually, the way someone looks at a thing when they know what they're looking for. She reached into the leather case and pulled out a chisel. Narrow blade, wooden handle worn dark with use. She turned it in her hand once, then she put it back. Mirko watched her do this from across the room. He didn't say anything. There were questions in that gesture, in the way she'd looked at the hinge, in the way she'd pulled the chisel and replaced it. But they weren't questions for him yet. He filed it away and left it there. Nelka had set the disk of clay down on the table beside her. It had changed again in the last few minutes. She'd pressed the edges up, slowly, the way you do without thinking about it when your hands know something your head hasn't caught up to yet. It wasn't a bowl. It was a bowl. The curve was uneven, the rim thicker on one side, but the shape was real. It had happened on its own, the way things happen when someone has the feeling of it in their hands without ever being taught. Mirko saw it. He didn't say anything about it. "The kiln," Zuna said. She was still looking at the iron door. Her voice was flat, carrying the same weight as Aska's, but with less heat in it. Aska pushed. Zuna observed. "When did you last fire it?" 2 weeks, Mirko said. "I've got a batch ready, waiting on the wind." She touched the outer face of the door with 2 fingers, not pushing, just touching, testing temperature, or surface, or something else. "Old kiln. Older than me." She made a sound that wasn't a word. She stepped back, looked at the door once more, and walked back toward the center of the room. She didn't look at Mirko as she passed him. She looked at the shelves of finished work, rows of jars and bowls and water vessels standing in the afternoon light, glaze fired to different depths of color. She looked at them the way she'd looked at the chisel, taking stock. Outside, through the open south window, the market town of Era made its ordinary afternoon sounds. Cartwheels, voices, the ring of a hammer somewhere on the far side of the square. All of it distant. The workshop held its own quiet against all of that, the stone walls keeping the heat in and the noise out. And in that quiet, the 3 of them were learning the shape of the room without asking permission. Aska moved to the sacks of raw clay stacked along the east wall, 4 of them, hemp cloth worn at the seams. She looked at them. She didn't ask. She picked up the nearest one and moved it to the table where Mirko had space cleared for mixing. Dry clay dust rose at the seam. She set it down without a sound and reached for the next. Mirko watched her carry the second sack. It was heavy. He'd been putting off moving them because the distance from the stack to the mixing table was short, but the weight was real, and the batch he was planning needed all four. He'd planned to do it in the morning when the day was cooler. He nodded, not at her specifically, just acknowledged. Asuka didn't look up. She set the second sack beside the first and reached for the third. The light through the windows was beginning to angle lower. Still white, still hard, but moving. The long slide toward late afternoon. The clay on Nilka's table had dried slightly at the rim where her fingers had pressed. She was tracing the edge now, feeling where it had gone uneven, not distressed by it. Just noting it, the way a hand notes a seam in cloth. Zuna came to stand near the window. She looked out at the kiln in the yard. The dome of it, pale stone, the black mouth of the fire door, the ground around it scoured clean by years of ash. Then she looked at the gate at the far end of the yard. It was latched, but not locked. The lane beyond it was visible in strips through the wooden slats. A man stood in the lane. He wasn't at the gate. He was 20 feet back from it, standing in the shade of the wall across the way. He wasn't doing anything except being there, which was its own kind of doing. He was looking at the gate with the patient attention of someone who already knows what's inside and is deciding what to do about it. Zuna looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Mirko. She said nothing. Mirko followed her gaze. He saw the man. He recognized him. The merchant from the market. The yard was quiet. The kiln sat cold in the heat. The gate held. Morning came in through the south windows, the same way it always did, low and white, hitting the shelf of finished pieces first, then spreading across the floor in a slow rectangle of light. Mirko was at the wheel before the town bells marked the hour. The clay was already centered, already moving. Some days the work started itself. Nilka was at the secondary table. She'd come in behind him, quiet, the soft ankle boots making almost no sound on the stone. She hadn't asked if she could be there. She'd sat down at the table the way you sit down at a table that's yours, except without the ease of ownership. More like someone sitting carefully in a chair they're not sure will hold them. She'd found the scrap clay from yesterday, still workable under the cloth he'd laid over it before closing up. And she'd pulled it toward her and begun. Mirko didn't say anything. He kept the wheel moving. He watched her from the edge of his attention, not staring, not teaching, just aware. She was doing what hands do when they've been near clay once and can't stop thinking about it. Pressing, lifting, feeling for the way the material wants to move. Most people fight the clay in the beginning. They push too hard, grip too tight, try to impose a shape before the clay has agreed to become anything. Nilka wasn't doing that. Her hands were patient. She pressed and released, like she was asking rather than telling. After a while, she'd pulled the ball into a low mound and begun working the center open with her thumbs, the same way she'd seen him do it yesterday. The wall rose. Crooked, yes. Thicker on one side. But it rose. Mirko looked at his own work, then at hers. He reached over, not to correct, just to show. He set his hand beside hers on the clay, not touching, and let her see the angle of his wrist, the way the heel of his hand braced while the fingers lifted. She watched for a moment. Then she adjusted her grip and tried again. The wall straightened, not perfectly, but it straightened. He pulled his hand back. She kept going. That was all. He didn't tell her she'd done well. She didn't ask. There was a kind of respect in that, in letting a thing be what it was without labeling it. Outside in the yard, Asuka was working. She'd found the clay sacks she'd moved yesterday and begun the mixing herself, unprompted, unasked. She'd located the mixing board against the east wall, the wooden paddles hanging above it, and she'd opened the first sack and started breaking the dry clay into the basin. Mirko had glanced out through the window when the sound started, the dull thud of clay against wood, and had seen her there, sleeves rolled to the shoulder, moving with an efficiency that said she'd done hard physical work before and had no interest in doing it slowly. The sacks were heavy. He'd watched her lift the third one without hesitation, the cords in her forearms taut with the weight, and tip it into the basin. And he'd noted it the way you note things that matter without wanting to make a moment of them. She was strong in the way that came from use, not from effort toward strength. It was different, he recognized it. He'd nodded once at the window, though she hadn't looked up. Zuna was in the yard, too, but not near the clay. She'd gone to the kiln at first light. Mirko had seen her through the window before he started the wheel, crouched at the fire door, the leather case open beside her, looking into the mouth of it with the focused attention she brought to everything. Not touching yet, looking first. He'd noticed that about her. She always looked before she touched. She pulled the chisel from the case, held it at the opening, then put it back. Pulled a flat spatula, put it back. She was reading something in the interior of the kiln that he apparently wasn't equipped to read. He let her read it. The morning moved. Mirko's jar grew. Nilka's wall rose and wavered and rose again. Oskar worked through the clay sacks one by one, the sound of mixing coming through the window at intervals, rhythmic, steady, the same pace for the first sack as for the last. The heat built slowly as the sun climbed, the workshop warming from its overnight cool toward the dry pressure of full midsummer. Mirko fired the kiln in his mind while his hands worked, calculating the batch. 12 jars finished and glazed, 8 bowls waiting on their second coat, 4 wide plates he'd been holding back for the fall order from the inn on the west side of the market square. The innkeeper was patient, but not without limits. 2 weeks was already pushing it. He heard the gate, not the crash of it opening, just the latch lifting from the outside. The particular sound of the iron tongue releasing from the bracket, a sound he knew the way you know sounds that belong to the perimeter of your days. He looked up from the wheel. Through the south window he could see the yard, the kiln, Zuna still crouched at the fire door. The gate was at the edge of his sightline, partly blocked by the corner of the house. Zuna had heard it too. She rose. Not fast, she didn't move fast. But she turned toward the gate, and her hand moved to the small knife at her belt. Not drawing it, resting there. The merchant stepped into the yard. He was a broad man, mid-40s, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something that looked like authority. He wore a good coat despite the heat, dark wool, brass buttons. He'd always dressed for power rather than comfort. Mirko had known him at a distance for years, the way you know anyone in a town the size of Ara. Well enough to recognize, not well enough to dislike personally until you had a reason. The merchant stopped when he saw Zuna. Zuna looked at him. She didn't say anything. She didn't move her hand. She just looked at him with the level, patient attention she'd been giving the kiln, reading him the way she read the fire door, looking for the weakness in the structure. The merchant looked from Zuna to the workshop window where Mirko's shape was visible behind the glass. He didn't address Zuna. He spoke to the window. "Potter." His voice carried without effort, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard across market squares. "I know they're here." Mirko got up from the wheel. He came through the yard door and stood in the heat of the morning, the leather apron over his shirt, clay drying on his wrists. He looked at the merchant across the yard. Zuna was 4 feet to his left, still at the kiln, still standing where she'd stood when the gate opened. Her hand was still at her belt, resting, not drawing. "I don't have what you're looking for," Mirko said. The merchant looked at Zuna, then back at Mirko. His expression was the expression of a man being precise on purpose. "You have orcs on your property. The same orcs who were expelled from the market this morning for theft." He let that sit for a moment. I saw them come through your gate last night." "Then you were watching my gate," Mirko said. "That's your business. This yard is mine." The merchant's jaw moved slightly, not speaking, just adjusting. He'd come here ready for a different kind of conversation, something more apologetic, more easily handled. Mirko wasn't giving him the shape he'd expected, and the merchant was recalibrating. "I'll be filing a formal notice with the council," he said. "Harboring accused individuals is a matter for the licensing board." He looked once more at Zuna. She met his eyes without expression. He turned and went back through the gate, latching it behind him with the same sound it had made when he'd come in. The yard was quiet. Mirko stood in the heat, sweat at the back of his neck, clay drying on his hands. He looked at the gate, then turned back toward the workshop. Zuna hadn't moved. She was looking at the gate the same way she'd looked at the kiln, the same way she looked at everything, measuring. Then she crouched back down at the fire door, opened the leather case beside her, and pulled out the chisel again. She pressed the blade against the inner lining of the kiln wall and drew it slowly across the surface, listening or feeling for something in the give of the material. She found it. A crack running from the upper left of the interior lining down toward the base of the firebox. Not visible from outside, visible now. She pressed her thumb into it, testing the depth. "Clay and sand," she said. Not to him, exactly, to the kiln. "I'll fix it." Mirko stood in the yard and looked at the crack she was pointing at, and at the merchant's gate latched shut across the lane, and at the smoke-scoured dome of the kiln against the white sky. Some problems you could fix, some you couldn't. The trick was knowing which kind you were holding. He went back inside. The merchant came back before noon. Mirko heard the gate this time before he saw it, the latch lifting with the same deliberate weight as before, no pretense of casualness. He was at the wheel, Nilka still at the secondary table, her bowl taller now by another 2 fingers of height. He set his hands still on the clay and listened to the footsteps cross the yard gravel. Then he got up, wiped his hands on the apron, and went out. The merchant was standing in the middle of the yard, the way he'd stood that morning, coat on despite the climbing heat, brass buttons catching the noon light. He'd brought nobody with him. That was either confidence or calculation, and with this man it was probably both. Zuna was at the kiln. She'd been there since mid-morning, working without pause. She'd mixed the repair paste herself, clay and coarse sand in a ratio Mirko hadn't seen before, slightly drier than what he'd have used, pressed into the crack in the interior lining with the flat spatula in long, deliberate strokes. She smoothed it, let it sit, smoothed it again. She hadn't asked him if the ratio was right. She hadn't asked him anything. She'd looked at the crack, looked at his materials along the east wall, and made her decision. When the merchant walked into the yard, she didn't stop working. She kept her back to him, the spatula moving in the same slow strokes, and the only sign she'd registered his presence at all was that her shoulders settled a fraction lower. Not tension leaving, just weight redistributing. The kind of adjustment a body makes when it's bracing for something it's already predicted. Mirko stopped in the yard between the workshop door and the kiln. "You were here this morning," he said. "I was," the merchant said. "And now I'm here again." He looked past Mirko at Zuna. He looked at the kiln. He looked at the yard with the slow inventory of a man pricing something. "I'll be direct with you, Dane. I saw those 3 come through your gate last night. I saw you close the workshop door when my guards were behind them. That's not coincidence. That's a choice. And choices have consequences in front of the council." Mirko kept his hands at his sides. The clay on his apron was beginning to dry and crack at the fold lines. "What do you want?" The merchant looked at him. "I want them gone. By nightfall." He said it without heat, That was the thing about this man. He never raised his voice. He just added weight to each word the way you'd add stones to a scale. You let them stay. You put yourself in front of a licensing complaint. The board has been looking for reasons since the Aldris business 4 years ago. You know that. The Aldris business. There it was. 4 years of keeping his head down and working clean, and the merchant still carried it like a coin he hadn't spent yet, turning it in his pocket, waiting for the right price. Mirko felt the familiar tightness across his sternum. Not anger, or not only anger. Something that had more to do with exhaustion than heat. He'd been managing this for 4 years. He was tired of managing it. "I don't have what you're looking for," Mirko said. The same words as this morning. Not because he hadn't thought of anything else, but because they were true, and true things held their shape better than clever ones. The merchant studied him for a moment. Then he looked past him at Zuna, who was still working, still had her back to them both. Her spatula made a dry sound against the interior of the kiln lining. Press, draw, press. The merchant watched her hands. "By nightfall," he said again. Then he turned and walked back through the gate. The latch dropped. Mirko stood in the yard. The noon heat pressed down on the stone and the gravel and the pale dome of the kiln, sweated his temples. Behind him, through the open workshop window, he could hear the faint sound of Nilka working, the soft compression of hands on clay, barely audible, more felt than heard. He turned around. Aska was at the fence. She was standing on the residential side, the gap between the workshop and the house where the fence ran. And she'd been there the whole time, he realized. The whole conversation. She'd heard it through the slats, maybe, or had been watching through the gap near the post. Her expression when he turned was the expression of someone who'd been listening and hadn't decided yet what to do with what they'd heard. She said nothing. She looked at him. He looked back. Then he looked past her, at the kiln, at Zuna, who had finally stopped working and was sitting back on her heels, looking at the interior of the firebox with the same focused patience she brought to everything. She had a smear of repair paste along the scar on her left forearm. She hadn't wiped it off. "You were going to fire it," Zuna said, not a question. She wasn't looking at him when she said it. She was looking at the inside of the kiln, at the crack she'd been sealing all morning. "The batch?" "Yes," Mirko said. "The crack goes deep on the left side." She touched the edge of the repaired section with one finger. "If you'd fired it this week without fixing it, the lining would have split by the 3rd hour. Lost the whole batch." She stood up, brushing paste from her palms, and finally looked at him. "You didn't know about the crack?" "No." She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved in her expression. Not quite satisfaction, not quite its opposite. More like a calculation completing. Then she looked at the repair. "It needs to cure 2 days before you fire." "All right," Mirko said. Behind him, the gate stayed latched. Somewhere past it, the merchant was walking back toward the market, toward the council hall, toward the complaint he'd promised to file. The sun was at its highest point, pouring down into the yard without mercy, and the paste in the kiln lining was drying in the heat, filling the crack from the inside out. Aska still hadn't spoken. She moved away from the fence and came into the yard properly, stopping near the kiln. She looked at the repair paste, at the crack beneath it. She looked at Zuna's hands, still dusty with the mixture. Then she looked at Mirko. "He'll do it," she said. "File the complaint." "Yes," Mirko said. "He will." A silence. The kind that isn't empty. The kind that has things in it, turning over, finding their shape. Aska's jaw set. "Then we should go." Her voice was flat, stripped of argument. Not an ultimatum. More like something she was saying because she felt she had to say it. The words a form she was filling out by rote. "We removed the problem." Mirko looked at the kiln, at the crack now sealed, at the batch of glazed pieces sitting in the workshop behind him, waiting on a firing they couldn't afford to lose. He thought about the innkeeper and the fall order and the 4 years of staying and working clean, and the way the merchant had said the Aldris business like it was still currency. "Or," he said, "you stay, and I fire a batch I've owed for 3 weeks. There's work here." He looked at Aska. Real work. Honest pay. Aska looked at him. He could see the refusal assembling itself in her, the familiar shape of it, the automatic reach for the exit. She'd been building that exit since the moment she'd walked through his door. He let her build it. He didn't help her dismantle it. That was her work. Then Zuna said, "Show me the inside of the kiln." He looked at her. She was already crouching again at the fire door, spatula in hand, pointing into the interior, not at the crack she'd repaired, but at the wall behind it, the deeper lining. "Here," she said. "And here. The original clay is compromised, not just the surface crack." She looked up at him over her shoulder, hazel eyes level. "It's the way it was built. Someone used the wrong ratio on the inner layer. It's been compensating for years." She stood, stepped back. "One good repair won't hold if the base is wrong. It needs to be done properly. All of it." Mirko crouched where she'd been crouching and looked where she'd pointed. He could see it, now that he knew where to look. The discoloration along the back wall, the subtle deformation at the joint where the firebox met the main chamber. He'd fired that kiln 200 times and never seen it. He straightened up. Behind the gate, the town of Era went about its afternoon. Carts on cobblestones, voices in the market square, the ordinary business of a place that had made its calculations about him years ago and saw no reason to revise them. He looked at Zuna. He looked at the kiln. He looked at Aska, who was watching him with her arms crossed, and her amber eyes tracking every shift in his expression. "Then fix it properly," he said. The yard held its heat. The latch on the gate didn't move. He told them that evening. They were in the workshop, the 4 of them, the late light coming through the south windows at a low angle and painting everything amber. Mirko sat on the stool beside the wheel. Aska was at the secondary table, not working, just sitting. Nilka had her bowl in front of her. She'd been refining the rim for an hour, small adjustments, patient. Zuna stood at the shelf of finished pieces with her back to the room, looking at the glaze work on a row of tall jars, reading the surface the way she read everything. Mirko said, "The town council is serious about licensing complaints. A second formal notice. The first was 4 years ago, and they can pull the workshop permit. Not immediately. There's a hearing process. But it's real." He kept his voice level, not minimizing, not dramatizing, just the shape of the thing. "The merchant knows that. He's not making an empty threat." Silence. The low light moved on the shelf. Aska said, "Then we leave." Same flat tone as before, same form she filled out by rote. But this time there was something underneath it, a tightness, barely audible, like a board that sounds solid but gives slightly when you stand on it. "That's one option," Mirko said. "It's the right one." She looked at her hands on the table. "We've caused you enough trouble already." "You haven't caused me anything I didn't invite." He looked at her until she looked back. "I closed the bolt." She held his gaze. Behind her, Zuna had turned from the shelf. She wasn't looking at Mirko. She was looking at Aska, watching her sister the way you watch someone standing at a ledge, not about to grab them, just present. "There's a batch that needs firing," Mirko said. 12 jars, 8 bowls, 4 plates. Fall order for the inn on the west side of the square. If I miss it, I lose the contract, and that's a third of my autumn income. He paused. The kiln needs 2 days to cure before I can fire. While it cures, there's glazing work. The plates need a second coat. The bowls need trimming. I can't do it all alone in 2 days. Nilka hadn't looked up from her bowl, but her hands had stilled. That's the work, Mirko said, if you want it. Aska looked at the table. She pressed one thumb into the wood grain, a small, contained gesture, the body thinking while the mind caught up. Mirko watched it and said nothing. He'd learned that intervening in that kind of silence was the fastest way to lose it. Zuna crossed the room. She moved past Aska without stopping, past Mirko without looking at him, and went to the kiln door in the yard. Visible through the open workshop door, the pale dome holding the last of the day's heat. She crouched at the fire opening and looked in. She was still for a long moment. Then she said, from the yard, "Show me the inside of the kiln. All of it." Mirko got up and went out. He crouched beside her at the fire door and held up the lamp he kept on the hook by the workshop door. The interior of the kiln opened up in the lamplight. The dome above, the grate, the firebox below, the lining wall running all the way around. He moved the light slowly, the way she'd taught him to look this morning, without knowing she was teaching him. "There," she said. She pointed to the upper left where she'd done the surface repair, then tracked her finger down and left to the back wall. "And there. You see the seam?" He looked. He saw it. The line where the original builder had joined 2 sections of lining, slightly misaligned, the clay shrinking differently on each side over years of heating and cooling. "I see it. That's where the stress concentrates." She pressed 2 fingers to the wall beside the seam, not touching, just indicating. "Every firing pushes it a little further. The surface crack was the symptom. This is the problem." She sat back on her heels. "To fix it properly, I need to relay the inner lining on the back wall. New clay, correct ratio, pressed in layers and dried between." She looked at him. 4 days of work, maybe 5, not 2. Mirko looked at the seam. He thought about the fall order. He thought about the merchant. He thought about 4 years of keeping his head down, and the way that hadn't, in the end, done much to change the shape of the debt. "And if we fire before you fix it?" "You lose the batch," she said. "The lining splits at the seam in the 3rd hour, and the temperature drops. The glaze won't set. You crack half the pieces from thermal shock." She paused. "Maybe more." He looked at the seam for another moment. Then he stood up. "Do it properly," he said. "All of it." She looked up at him from her crouch. Something moved in her expression, brief, contained. Not surprise, more like something that had been waiting for permission and had now received it. She looked back at the kiln. "I'll need materials, specific clay, higher grog content, sand, clean, no organic matter. A few tools I don't have. Tell me what you need. I'll get it tomorrow." She nodded, once. Already somewhere else in her attention, already planning. When Mirko came back into the workshop, Aska was standing. She hadn't moved to the door. She was just on her feet, which was its own kind of answer. Nilka looked up from the bowl. Her light amber eyes moved from Aska to Mirko and back. Aska said, "1 week. We work the week, take the pay, and then we're done." She said it the way you say something you want to be a condition, but which you know, even as you're saying it, might not hold. Not a lie. Just a shape she needed to put around things so they fit in her hands. "All right," Mirko said. He meant it. If 1 week was what she needed to call it, 1 week was what it was. He'd learned that forcing a frame on a thing before it was ready to hold one was how you cracked it. Nilka set the bowl down on the table and looked at it. The rim was even now, or close to even, one short section still slightly thick. She'd been at it for an hour. She touched the thick section with one finger, lightly, feeling the difference. Then she looked up at Mirko. "Can a crooked pot be fired?" He looked at the bowl. The wall was uneven in places, the base slightly off-center. It was the first thing she'd made, and it showed. Not badly, not hopelessly, but clearly. He considered it. "Everything can be fired," he said. "Not everything survives it." She looked at the bowl. She looked at him. She didn't ask anything else. Zuna came back in from the yard, the case over her shoulder, the spatula clean and replaced. She looked at the three of them standing in the late light without comment. She went to the wall and sat down, back against the stone, and pulled the bronze chain at her neck over her fingers, not fidgeting, just holding. The triangular plate caught the lamplight. Outside, the town of Era was going quiet for the evening, shutters closing, market stalls folding down. The merchants' windows were lit on the far side of the square. The council hall was dark. The complaint hadn't been filed yet. It would wait for morning, for the formal hour, for the weight of daylight behind it. 2 days for the cure, 4 or 5 for the repair. A week of work. Some cracks you could fix. Some took longer than you thought. The trick was staying at it long enough to find out which kind you had. The lamp burned. The bowl sat on the table, crooked and whole. Zuna started on the kiln mining at first light. Mirko heard her before he saw her. The scrape of the spatula against the interior wall, steady and methodical, coming through the open window while he was still pulling on his shirt. By the time he crossed the yard with the lamp, she'd already stripped the compromised section of the back wall down to the base layer, the old clay coming away in dry, curved pieces that she stacked neatly at the side of the fire door. Not scattered, stacked. He noted that and went inside to start the wheel. She worked without asking for anything. That was the first thing. He'd left the materials she'd requested along the east wall the evening before. The high grog clay in a sealed sack, the clean sand in a wooden box, a flat iron tool he'd tracked down from the smithy on the north end of the market. And when he came out at mid-morning to check the progress, the sack was open, the sand box was beside it, and the tool was in her hand. She'd mixed a new lining clay herself, dry ingredients first, then water added in small amounts and worked in with her palms. The consistency tested between her fingers until it held the right shape without crumbling. She pressed the first layer into the stripped wall in long, even strokes, working from the base upward, overlapping each pass by a finger's width. She didn't look up when he came to the door. He watched her for a moment, the burn scar on her left forearm moving with the work, the leather case open beside her, chisels and spatulas arranged in the order she used them, and then went back inside. There was nothing to say. The work was being done correctly. That was the whole of it. Inside, Nilka was at the table. She'd moved past the bowl she'd finished yesterday and was working with a fresh piece of clay, larger, more ambitious. The walls already taller than anything she'd attempted before. Her hands had learned something overnight, the way hands sometimes do when the body sleeps on a problem the mind couldn't crack. She wasn't fighting the clay. She was in a conversation with it, patient and specific, and the shape coming up under her fingers had a quality the first bowl hadn't, a deliberateness, a sense of the maker knowing what she wanted before the clay did. Mirko watched her work and said nothing and went back to the wheel. The morning passed in its own heat. The sun climbed, and the stone walls of the workshop held the warmth, and the smell of wet clay thickened in the still air. Mirko worked through the backlog, trimming the bowls, cutting the foot rings, checking the glaze on the plates where it had pooled at the edges and needed leveling. Precise work, close work, the kind that kept the hands occupied and left the mind running quietly underneath. He thought about the hearing notice that had arrived that morning. A folded paper, official seal, slipped under the gate while he was at the wheel. 2 days. The council convened in the old hall on the east side of the square, and the licensing board sat in the back room, and complaints were heard in order of filing date, and the merchant had been thorough. Mirko had read the notice twice, refolded it, and put it in the drawer under the wheel where he kept documents. Then he'd picked up his trimming tool and gone back to the bowls. It was midday when Oska appeared. She came through the yard gate. She had been out since early morning, gone before Mirko had crossed the yard with his lamp, back now with a cloth bundle under one arm. She set it on the table inside the workshop without ceremony, without explanation, and unwrapped it. Bread, still warm. A wedge of hard cheese. 4 small tomatoes, deeply red, split along one side from the heat. She'd spent the last of something to get it. He knew that without being told. Knew it from the way she set each item down with the careful precision of someone who understood the exact weight of what they'd parted with. Mirko sat down and ate. He didn't ask where it came from. She didn't tell him. Nilka took the bread she was handed and ate it over her clay, careful not to let crumbs fall into the work. Zuna came in from the yard, hands dusted with dried clay, and sat at the far end of the table and ate without looking at anyone. The food was plain, and it was enough, and no one said anything about it being either. After, Oska went back outside. Mirko heard her in the yard, not at the kiln, not near Zuna, but on the far side near the clay storage where the mixing boards were stacked. The sound of wood on stone, then the rhythmic compression of clay being wedged, the dull, dense thud of it turned and pressed and turned again. She'd found the secondary batch he'd been putting off. Raw clay that needed wedging before it could be used, the air pockets worked out, the consistency made uniform. He'd been putting it off for a week. She hadn't been asked. She'd looked at it sitting there and made her own calculation. The afternoon deepened. Zuna came back inside once to check the drying of the first layer against the wall. She pressed her palm flat against it, held it there, feeling for temperature, for give, and then went back out. The second layer would go on before evening, pressed thinner than the first, smoothed with the flat iron tool, and then it would need to dry overnight before she could assess whether a third was necessary. She was moving at the pace the material required, not faster, and she hadn't asked him once whether he thought she was taking too long. Mirko glazed the plates in the late afternoon light. It was careful work. The second coat had to go on evenly, no runs, no thin patches. The brush loaded the same amount each pass. He worked slowly, the brush moving in the same direction every stroke, and thought about the hearing. He thought about the witnesses the merchant would bring. He'd have them. The merchant always had them. Men from the market who owed him debts or feared his ledger. He thought about what he had on his side, which was the truth, and very little else, and about how far the truth had gotten him 4 years ago. The light through the windows was going long and amber. Nilka had set her new piece aside to dry and was looking at the bowl from yesterday, the first one, crooked, rim uneven on one side. She picked it up and turned it in her hands, slowly. She wasn't unhappy with it. She was just looking at it the way you look at the first version of something, knowing it's not the last. She put it back on the shelf. Not her shelf, his shelf, where the finished pieces stood waiting for firing. Among the even jars and the clean bowls and the glazed plates. She set it there without asking. Mirko saw her do it. He kept the brush moving. The council notice was in the drawer. 2 days. The evening was coming down warm and slow over the yard, and from outside he could hear Zuna still working, the sound of the spatula, press and draw, and the occasional thud of Aska wedging clay. And these sounds were so specific and domestic and unremarkable that it took him a moment to understand what they were. Then the gate moved. The latch lifted. Not the deliberate weight of the merchant this time, but a different sound, faster, lighter. A boy from the council hall came through with a second paper in his hand, this one sealed in red rather than blue. Mirko took it at the yard door and read it in the evening light. Not a change to the hearing date. An amendment to the original complaint. The merchant had added a second charge, damage to market property, unspecified, filed that afternoon. Mirko folded the paper along its original creases. He stood in the yard with the evening heat on his back and the sound of the kiln work behind him and the paper in his hand. A second charge meant a second line of testimony. More witnesses. A longer proceeding. The board didn't like long proceedings. They had a tendency to resolve them in the direction that created less paperwork, which was rarely the direction of the person without connections. He put the paper in his apron pocket. He went back inside. He picked up the brush and finished the last plate. Some things you couldn't think your way out of before they arrived. You just kept the work going and waited to see what shape the trouble took when it got there. The plates dried on the rack. Outside, Suna pressed the second layer of lining into the back wall of the kiln in the last of the light, smooth and even, and the yard smelled of fresh clay and warm stone. The second day of the kiln repair moved slower than the first. Suna had assessed the third layer that morning, pressed her palm to the second, held it, moved her hand in a slow arc across the surface, and determined it needed one more pass before the lining would hold. She mixed the new clay in smaller amounts this time, working it longer between her palms before applying it, and the strokes she made were shorter, more deliberate. The final layer was the thinnest. It had to be right. She knew that without being told, and didn't need to be told. Mirko watched her work for a few minutes from the workshop doorway, and then went back to the wheel. The batch was waiting. The hearing was tomorrow. These two facts sat in the same space in his chest, and he'd stopped trying to keep them separate. Nilka had filled the secondary table. It had happened gradually. He hadn't tracked each piece individually, but at some point in the last 2 days the table had acquired a population. The first bowl, crooked, now sitting on his shelf. A second piece, taller, more even, drying on the table itself. A small flat dish she'd made yesterday from the scraps after Oska wedged the secondary batch. A pinched cup, thumb wide, that she'd made in perhaps 20 minutes and left on the corner without comment. She wasn't making things to show him. She was making things because the clay was there and her hands had started to require it. He looked at the shelf. Her bowl sat between two of his jars. His work taller, more uniform, the glaze applied with the even hand of long practice. Her bowl smaller, the wall varying in thickness. One side of the rim still slightly proud of the other. But the shape had intention in it. You could see what she had been reaching for, even where she hadn't quite arrived. He left it where it was. Oska had been restless since the second council notice arrived. He felt it in the way she moved through the space, purposeful in the morning, edged by midday, her amber eyes moving to the gate more often than they needed to. She wasn't afraid, or not exactly. She was calculating. She'd been calculating since the first morning, running the numbers of the situation against some internal ledger he didn't have access to, and the second notice had changed the figures in a way she didn't like. She came to him mid-morning while he was trimming and asked about the hearing, not with words, but by stopping near the wheel and standing there with her arms crossed and her jaw set, which he'd come to understand was her version of a question. He told her what he knew: the council hall, the licensing board, the amended complaint, what a second charge meant for the proceeding. He kept his voice the same way he kept his hands on the clay, steady, not gripping too hard. She listened. Then she said that if they left now, Before the hearing, the complaint might lose its teeth. No accused present on the property, no ongoing violation to point to. It was reasonable. It was the kind of logic that came from experience with situations that didn't resolve in your favor. The logic of people who'd learned to cut losses early because the alternative had cost them too much before. He told her he was already in it, with or without them. The first complaint was filed, the date was set, the board would convene regardless. Leaving now wouldn't undo the thing that had been started. It would just mean he stood in front of the board alone, with less to show for the week than he'd have had otherwise. She looked at him for a moment. Then she uncrossed her arms and went back to the far side of the workshop, where she'd been sorting the dried pieces by size, and she picked up where she'd left off. It wasn't agreement, exactly, but she stayed. Zuna came in from the kiln at noon and washed her hands at the basin. Gray water, the familiar ribbon of clay running off her fingers. She dried them on the cloth, and then came to stand near the shelf where Mirko had laid out the batch ready for firing. She looked at each piece in turn, the jars, the bowls, the plates, with the slow attention she gave to everything. She picked up one of the tall jars and turned it, looking at the foot ring, the shoulder, the lip. She set it back. She said nothing about the quality of the work, which was its own kind of assessment. Then she asked about the hearing. Not directly. She picked up a second jar and turned it in her hands and asked, without looking at him, what the board would need to see to drop the complaint. He told her. Testimony, witnesses, documentation of the original false charge, if it existed. The first complaint, 4 years ago, had been resolved through attrition. The merchant had moved on to other concerns. The board had closed the file without verdict. There was no documentation in his favor. There was just time having passed. She set the jar down. She asked, still without looking at him, whether he'd thought about leaving. He said no. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her thinking. Not the quick, hot calculation that Aska did, but something slower and more structural, the way she assessed the kiln, looking for the scene where the pressure was concentrating. Then she said that she and her sisters could leave instead, that the removal of the cause might simplify the complaint, that she understood what a license meant to a workshop like this. He told her what he'd told Aska. He was already in it. She looked at him then. A long look, level hazel eyes reading him the way she read surfaces, for cracks, for compromised layers, for places where the structure wasn't what it appeared. Whatever she found, or didn't find, she kept to herself. She picked up the trimming tool he'd left on the edge of the shelf and set it back in the correct place on the tool rack and went back outside. Nilka worked through all of this without appearing to notice any of it. She was at the table with a new piece of clay, a taller form than anything she'd attempted, the wall coming up in slow rotations of her hands. She'd started to use the banding wheel he kept in the corner, the small turntable for hand building, and the symmetry of her work had improved with it. Her fingers understood the rotation now, could feel where the wall was pulling unevenly, and correct it before it became a problem. The shelf filled. Her pieces accumulated beside his, the pinched cup, the flat dish, the second bowl, now this taller form taking shape. They were unmistakably hers. Slightly irregular, the surfaces carrying the marks of her hands rather than a tool. The rims bearing the evidence of decisions made and revised and made again. They looked like something. They looked like the beginning of a way of working. Outside, the afternoon moved. The kiln repair was drying. The batch waited on its shelf. The hearing was tomorrow, and Mirko had been turning over in his mind for 2 days the question of witnesses, of what testimony existed, of who in Ara might have seen the merchant in the market that morning in a way that told a different story than the one he'd told the guards. He hadn't been in the market that morning. He'd been at the wheel. He hadn't seen the expulsion happen, hadn't seen what the merchant had claimed as theft. But someone had. Markets were full of people, and the market of Ara was no different. Stall holders, porters, the woman who sold herbs from a cart near the east entrance, the two boys who swept the square before the stalls opened. Someone had been there and seen and formed their own account of it. The question was whether any of them would say so. That night, after the workshop was closed and the lamp was low, and Mirko was at the table with the 2 council notices flat in front of him, he heard the gate open. Not the deliberate weight of the merchant, the quiet, careful click of someone who didn't want to be heard. Oska. He heard her cross the yard, the soft sound of her boots on the gravel, the gate closing behind her. He heard her go out through the lane. He sat at the table and didn't move, and looked at the 2 folded papers in front of him. She hadn't told him she was going. She didn't need to. Whatever she was doing, it was her business, conducted in her own way, and he'd learned enough about her by now to know that her way was not the way you interfered with. He folded the notices back into their creases and put them in the drawer. He blew out the lamp. He sat in the dark workshop for a while, the residual heat of the day in the stone walls around him, and listened to the town of Ara settle into its night sounds. Distant, ordinary, continuous. The lining in the kiln was drying. By morning it would be ready. Something would be ready by morning. He wasn't sure what. He left before the town was fully awake. The lane outside the gate was gray with early light, the cobblestones still holding the night's cool, and Mirko walked through it with the 2 council notices in his apron pocket and no particular plan beyond the direction he was heading. The market square was empty at this hour. Stalls not yet open, the sweet boys finishing their work at the far end, the herb woman just arriving with her cart, the wheels of it catching on the uneven stones near the east entrance. He'd thought about this for 2 days. He'd been methodical about it, the way he was methodical about glaze ratios and firing temperatures. Going through what he knew, what he'd seen, what could be verified. The merchant's claim was that the 3 sisters had taken goods from a stall near the center of the market. That was the charge. Simple, specific. The kind of accusation that sounded credible because it was concrete. What Mirko needed was someone who'd been near that stall that morning and had seen something that didn't fit the merchant's version. He started with the sweet boys. They were finishing near the east entrance, 2 of them, 12 or 13, moving in the unhurried way of people whose work is almost done. He knew one of them by sight, the taller one, whose older brother sometimes helped carry clay shipments from the river. He approached without hurrying, without urgency, and stood at a distance until the boy looked up. Then he asked, the way you ask something when you already suspect the answer but need to hear it confirmed, whether either of them had been working the center section of the market on the morning the guards had expelled the orcs. The taller boy looked at the shorter one. Something passed between them, the quick, private calculation of children deciding how much to say to an adult. The shorter one had been there, near the central stalls. He'd seen the expulsion. He'd been sweeping the stones beside the grain merchant's stall when it happened. Mirko listened to what the boy described, haltingly, in pieces, looking at the ground more than at Mirko, and felt something settle in his chest. Not relief, exactly. More like a shape completing. The boy had seen the merchant speak to the guards, had seen the guards move before they'd checked anything, before they'd looked at the sisters' bags or asked any questions. The merchant had pointed and the guards had moved, and the whole thing had taken perhaps 2 minutes, and the boy had watched it from beside the grain sacks because he hadn't known what else to do. Mirko asked if there were others who'd seen it the same way. The taller boy said the herb woman had been setting up her cart near the entrance when the sisters came through. She'd have seen their bags when they passed. He found the herb woman arranging bundles on her cart by the east gate. Dried lavender, rosemary, loose mint in a cloth-lined box. She was a practical woman, somewhere past 50, who'd had a stall in this market for 30 years and had accumulated in that time a comprehensive and unsentimental view of its workings. She listened to Mirko's account without interrupting. Then she confirmed, without being asked to elaborate, that she'd seen the three sisters pass her cart on their way into the market, and that she'd looked at what they were carrying. She looked at everyone who passed. It was habit. 30 years of habit. And that they'd had nothing in their hands and nothing bulging in their bags that hadn't been there when they arrived. She said it the way she priced herbs, matter-of-factly, without investment in how it was received. He asked if she'd be willing to say so at a council hearing. She looked at him for a moment. Then she began retying one of her lavender bundles, the knot firm and practiced. She said she'd already considered saying something to someone, but hadn't known who. She said the merchant had run 2 other stall holders out of the central section over the past 3 years through similar proceedings, and that she'd watched it happen both times without speaking. She said this without self-excuse, as a plain statement of prior behavior, the way you'd note a crack in a wall that you'd been meaning to address. She'd be at the hearing. Mirko walked back through the lane to the workshop. He came through the yard gate in the full morning light and stopped. The kiln was burning. Not a test fire, a proper firing. The smoke rising from the chimney and the clean vertical column that meant the temperature was climbing correctly, the draft pulling well. The fire door was closed. The yard smelled of heat and ash and the particular mineral quality of glaze beginning to melt. He stood for a moment and looked at the smoke and thought about the batch inside, the 12 jars, the 8 bowls, the 4 plates for the innkeeper, and understood that someone had loaded and lit the kiln while he was gone. Zuna was at the far end of the yard, beside the clay storage. She'd set up the mixing board out there and was wedging the leftover clay from the repair, working it into usable form rather than letting it dry and waste. Her back was to him. She didn't turn when he came through the gate, but the set of her shoulders said she'd heard the latch. Nilka was inside. He could see her through the window, at the table, working. Beside her on the shelf, her pieces stood in a row. He counted them without meaning to. 6 pieces now, in addition to the first bowl he'd already placed among his own work. 6 pieces in 4 days. He crossed the yard to the kiln and crouched at the fire door, checking the temperature gauge set into the outer wall, a simple clay indicator, a cone of specific composition that bent at the target temperature. Still straight. An hour or more before the peak. The fire was burning clean, and the draft was even. And whoever had loaded the pieces had loaded them correctly. He could tell by the sound of the draw, the quality of the smoke, the absence of the low, uneven rumble that meant a piece had shifted on the shelf. He straightened up. He looked at Zuna's back. She kept wedging. The clay turned under her hands, heel pressed in, folded over, turned, pressed. She worked with the same methodical pace she brought to everything, not fast, not slow, just the pace the material required. Her left arm moved through the work, the burn scar catching the light each time her forearm rotated, the long, pale line of it moving in and out of shadow. He stood in the yard for a while, watching the smoke rise. He thought about the herb woman's lavender bundles, the knot firm and practiced. He thought about what it meant to watch something happen twice without speaking. He thought about the sweep boy looking at the ground while he described what he'd seen. The way the words came out haltingly, in pieces, not because he was lying, but because he'd been carrying them around for a week and didn't know what to do with them. Some things waited for the right person to come and ask. That was all they needed. Just someone to come and ask. He went inside. Nilka looked up from the table when he came in. A quick glance, then back to her work. She was building the taller form he'd seen her start yesterday, the walls coming up with more confidence now, the rotation of the banding wheel visible in the slight regularity of the surface. Her hands moved without hesitation. They'd stopped asking permission from her head somewhere in the last 2 days, and had started just knowing. He went to the shelf. He looked at the batch pieces, the spaces where the jars and bowls had been, now empty, now inside the kiln. He looked at Nilka's pieces standing in a row. He looked at the first bowl, the crooked one, sitting between his two tall jars. He looked at all of it for a long time. The smell of the kiln came through the open window. Heat and ash, and the faint sharp smell of glaze beginning to move. He went back to the wheel. He sat down. He set his hands to a new piece of clay. Not the batch, not work for anyone, just clay, just the wheel, just his hands finding their way through the familiar resistance of it. The kiln burned. The temperature climbed. The smoke rose in a clean column above the yard. He heard Zuna come in from outside. He heard her wash her hands at the basin, the gray water running, the cloth taken from the hook. He heard her cross the room behind him toward the shelf where the remaining pieces sat. She stopped there. The silence lasted a long time. Long enough that he finished the base of his piece and began pulling the walls before it ended. Then from behind him, her voice, flat, unornamented, carrying only its own weight. Good. One word. The way she said it, it meant something closer to, the temperature is correct, the draft is even, the pieces were loaded without error, the work that was done properly. It meant, I looked and found no fault. From her, that was the whole of it. Mirko kept his hands on the clay. The wheel turned. The council hall was on the east side of the square, a stone building older than most of what surrounded it, its walls thick enough that the interior stayed cool, even in midsummer. Mirko arrived early. He sat in the corridor outside the licensing board's back room, on a bench worn smooth by years of people waiting to be told things they already half knew. And he looked at the floor and thought about nothing in particular. The herb woman arrived a few minutes after him. She sat at the far end of the bench and retied one of her wrist wraps, a habitual gesture he was beginning to understand, the same way he straightened tools on the rack when he needed something to do with his hands. She didn't look at him, and he didn't look at her, and between them the corridor held its cool, indifferent quiet. The sweep boy came with his older brother, who'd taken the morning off from the clay shipments to accompany him. The boy sat between the two adults and looked at the floor with the focused attention of someone trying to be smaller than they were. The merchant arrived last, with two men Mirko recognized from the market, both of them regular faces, the kind of men who appeared wherever the merchant needed them to appear, whose presence was reliable in the way that owed things were reliable. They stood rather than sat. The merchant looked at Mirko once, the brief, assessing look of a man checking a column of figures, and then looked at the door of the boardroom. The proceeding took less time than Mirko had expected. The board was 3 people, a woman who managed the guild records, an older man who'd been on the council since before Mirko came to Ara, and a younger one whose name he'd never learned. They sat behind a table and heard each account in turn, and the accounts were what they were. The merchant's version, specific and weighted, his 2 witnesses corroborating the shape of it, but vague on particulars, and then the herb woman, who described what she'd seen with the same matter-of-fact precision she used to price lavender, and the sweep boy, who got through his account with his eyes on the floor and his voice barely above the threshold of audible, but who didn't waver on the substance of it. The board asked questions. The merchant answered them smoothly. The herb woman answered them the same way she'd answered Mirko's, plainly, without elaboration, without the slight over-precision that indicated someone had rehearsed. The sweep boy answered them in pieces and pauses, and the pauses themselves said something, because a child lying doesn't pause the same way a child remembering does. The board conferred. Briefly. The kind of brief that meant the outcome had been clear before the conferring began. The complaint was dropped. Both charges, the original and the amended one filed 2 days after. The woman managing the guild records made a note in the ledger. The older board member said something about the proper threshold of evidence for market explosions that was aimed at the merchant without being addressed to him. The younger one said nothing. Mirko walked back through the market square in the full heat of midday. The stalls were busy, the square full of the ordinary compressed noise of commerce, and he moved through it without stopping. He felt the way he sometimes felt after unloading a kiln. Not relief, not triumph, but a kind of specific emptiness. The space where the tension had been, now vacated and not yet filled with anything else. He came through the lane, through the gate, into the yard. The three of them were there. Zuna at the kiln, where the fire had burned down to coals overnight, and the temperature was dropping through its long, careful descent toward the point where the door could be opened without cracking the pieces inside. Nilka at the table, visible through the workshop window. Aska sitting on the low wall beside the clay storage, which was not where she usually sat, which meant she'd been watching the gate. He told them the complaint was dropped. He said it plainly, the same way the herb woman gave testimony. The fact, its dimensions, nothing added. Zuna looked at the kiln door and didn't look at him. Nilka appeared in the workshop doorway and stood there. Aska sat on the low wall and looked at the gravel between her boots. The silence that followed had its own texture. Not relief, or not only. Something more complicated. The way endings are always more complicated than you expect them to be. Because an ending in one direction is usually also a beginning in another. And beginnings require decisions. Aska looked up from the gravel. She said they could leave now. She said it the same way she'd said it the first morning, the same flat form, but it sounded different now, thinner, as if the certainty had been used up somewhere in the past week, and what was left was the shape of the phrase without the conviction behind it. She looked at him when she said it, which she hadn't always done. He told her she could. That was true. The road was open, the complaint was gone. Nothing held them here. He said it without pulling on it, without adding weight to either side. Then he looked at the kiln and said there was work. The batch needed unloading when the temperature dropped, and the secondary clay Aska had wedged needed to be covered before the heat dried it out, and the kiln, now that the lining was properly repaired, could take another batch before the fall market if they started the next round of pieces this week. He said it the way you describe the contents of a room. Just what was in it. No instruction about whether to enter. Zuna had been looking at the kiln door throughout. Now she looked at the workshop. Through the open door, at the shelf, at the row of Nilka's pieces standing in the afternoon light. She looked at them the way she'd looked at everything all week. Reading the structure, finding the seam. Her expression shifted, barely, the way surfaces shift when the pressure underneath them changes. Not softness. Something that had been holding a particular shape for a long time and had quietly, without announcement, let it go. Nilka stepped out of the workshop doorway and into the yard. She looked at Mirko. Then she looked at Zuna. Then she asked the question she'd been carrying for days. Her voice quiet, direct, asking whether her pot could be fired. Not the new ones. Not the taller form still drying on the table. The first one. The crooked bowl she'd put on his shelf, among his work, without asking. Mirko looked at her. She was 16, and she'd made something real in 4 days, and she was asking permission for it to go through fire, which was the only way to know if it would hold. Everything can be fired, he told her. He said it the same way he'd said it before, but this time it landed differently, or she received it differently, which was the same thing. She looked at the kiln. She looked at the closed fire door, the coals glowing through the gap at the base, the dome pale above it in the afternoon heat. She looked at it the way you look at something you've been circling for a long time, and have finally decided to walk up to directly. Aska was still on the low wall. She hadn't said anything since her one sentence. She looked at Nilka looking at the kiln, and her jaw shifted. Not speaking, just moving. The way a jaw moves when the words you thought you were going to say have turned into different ones, and you haven't found those yet. Zona looked at the kiln, at Nilka's shelf through the workshop door, at Mirko. Her hand moved to the bronze plate at her neck, rested there, the way it did when she was making calculations, and then dropped. The yard held its heat. The coals breathed behind the fire door. Somewhere past the gate, the town of Era conducted its afternoon, indifferent, continuous, unaware of the particular specific gravity of this particular yard in this particular moment. Mirko went to the kiln and pressed his palm to the outer wall, feeling the temperature through the stone. Still too hot. Another hour at least before the door could come open safely. He kept his hand there for a moment. Then he crossed to the wheel and sat down and set his hands to the clay. There was work. There was always work. The question of who was here to do it would answer itself, or it wouldn't. And either way, the clay was on the wheel, and the wheel was turning. Behind him, no one moved to leave. The kiln door opened at dusk. Mirko worked the iron handles slowly, the hinges stiff from the heat, requiring both hands and a particular angle he'd learned over years of openings just like this one. The heat that came out was dry and total, the kind that presses against the face and makes the eyes water. He stepped back and let it breathe for a moment before reaching in. Behind him, the yard was quiet. The sun had dropped behind the roof line of the house next door, and the light in the yard was the particular blue-gray of summer evenings. Everything softened, the stone walls holding the warmth of the day without the harshness of it. He unloaded the batch piece by piece, setting each one on the low table he'd positioned beside the kiln for this purpose. The 12 jars first. He turned each one in his hands, checking the glaze, the foot ring, the lip. Clean. Even. The glaze had moved exactly as much as it needed to, and no more. The surface of it holding a depth that only came from a firing where the temperature had climbed correctly and held. The bowls next. 8 of them. And these were good, too. Better than good. The best batch he'd fired in 2 years. And he understood why. The lining repair had changed the airflow inside the chamber, evened out the hot spots he'd been compensating for unconsciously, for longer than he'd known there were hot spots to compensate for. The plates last, 4 of them for the innkeeper. He set each one down and looked at it in the evening light, and felt the quiet, specific satisfaction of work that had come out right. Then, at the back of the second shelf, his hand found something he hadn't placed there himself. He drew it out carefully. Nilka's bowl. The first one, crooked, the rim thicker on one side, the wall varying in places where her hands had been learning what they were doing. He'd placed it on his shelf, and she'd moved it to the kiln shelf herself, sometime in the 2 days between when he'd said everything can be fired and when the batch went in. He hadn't seen her do it. She'd done it the same way she did most things, quietly, without asking, trusting the answer she'd already received. It had survived the firing. The clay had darkened in the heat, the natural red-brown of the Era basin clay going several shades deeper, almost black at the thickest points. There was a small crack along the base, not structural, not a failure, the kind of crack that forms when clay of uneven thickness moves through temperature change, the thicker section contracting at a different rate than the thinner. It ran perhaps 2 finger widths along the foot, and stopped. The bowl was whole. Crooked, dark, cracked at the base, and whole. He carried it inside. Nilka was at the table. She looked up when he came through the door, and her eyes went immediately to his hands, to the bowl. She didn't move toward it. She waited, the way she'd learned to wait all week. The way she'd learned that things arrived at their own pace, and grabbing for them changed the shape of them. He set it on the table in front of her. She picked it up with both hands. She turned it slowly, the way he'd seen her turn pieces all week, not evaluating, just feeling. She found the crack along the base with her thumb and traced it, end to end, feeling the line of it. She looked at the darkened clay, the depth of color the firing had given it. She looked at the rim, uneven still, the thick section on one side unchanged by the heat. She held it for a long time. Zuna was at the far end of the workshop cleaning the repair tools, the chisels and spatulas back in the leather case, the flat iron tool wrapped in cloth. She worked without looking at her sister, but her hands slowed. She cleaned the same chisel twice, which was not something she did. Oscar was beside the shelves, where she'd been since the unloading started, standing, not working, watching. Her arms were not crossed. They hung at her sides, which, for Aska, was its own kind of openness. She looked at Nilka holding the bowl. Her expression did something complicated and quiet, and then settled. Mirko went to the wheel. He sat down. He took a piece of clay from the board and began to center it. The familiar pressure of it, the resistance gradually giving, the clay finding its axis under his hands. He didn't look at any of them. He looked at the clay. The workshop was very quiet. The sounds that existed were small and domestic. The faint scrape of Zuna's cloth on the chisel, the soft groan of the wheel bearing as it turned, the evening insects starting up outside in the lane. The heat of the day was still in the stone walls, but changing quality, becoming the comfortable warmth of a space that has been inhabited, rather than the pressing weight of a summer afternoon. Nilka stood up. She carried the bowl to the shelf. His shelf, the main one, the long shelf along the north wall where the finished work stood waiting for collection or sale, the jars and bowls and plates arranged in their rows, even, glazed, uniform. She stood in front of it for a moment. Then she found a space between two of his jars, not at the end, not set apart, but in among them, and she placed the bowl there. She stepped back and looked at it. It sat between his two tall jars, dark and crooked and cracked at the base, and completely itself. The glazed surfaces of his work caught the lamplight evenly. Her bowl caught it differently. The unglazed clay holding the light in a different way, absorbing rather than reflecting, the color of it deep and uneven and particular. Nobody said anything. Zuna closed the leather case. The brass clasp caught with a small, clean sound. She picked it up and set it beside the wall where she'd been keeping it all week. And then she stood where she'd been standing and looked at the shelf. At Nilka's bowl among the row of finished pieces. Her face did what it had been doing all week in very small ways. The incremental release of something long held, so gradual that no single moment of it was visible. Only the accumulation of moments. Only the fact that what was there now was not what had been there a week ago. Aska moved from where she'd been standing. She crossed the room and came to stand beside her youngest sister, and she looked at the shelf too, at the bowl, at the jars on either side of it. She reached out and touched the rim of one of his jars with one finger, lightly, the way Nilka had touched everything in the beginning, and then drew her hand back. Mirko kept his hands on the clay. The wheel turned. The walls rose. Outside, through the south window, the last of the evening light was leaving the yard. The kiln stood open and empty, its heat still radiating into the cooling air. The lining on the back wall cured and solid, and ready for the next firing. The low table beside it held the batch. The jars, the bowls, the 4 plates for the innkeeper, waiting for morning and collection. Above the gate, the first stars were appearing in the pale sky, small and unhurried. The shelf held what it held, his work, even and glazed, and done with long practice. Her bowl, dark and crooked and cracked and whole, standing in among it. The lamp threw its light across all of them equally, making no distinction, finding no hierarchy in what it touched. Mirko pulled the walls of his piece higher. The clay thinned and rose. Outside, the kiln breathed its last heat into the evening. And here, before we close, if you've made it this far with Mirko and the three sisters, through the heat and the clay and the quiet standoffs in that yard, I want to ask you something. Not about orcs or potters or fictional towns. About you. Has there ever been a moment when you chose to leave a door unbolted? Not because it was smart, not because you knew how it would turn out, but simply because you remembered what it felt like to stand on the other side of one. If that question landed somewhere in you, leave a comment below. And if this kind of story is what you come here for, the slow kind, the kind that takes its time, then subscribe and stay. The next fire is already laid. Nilka's bowl stood on the shelf. Mirko's wheel turned in the lamplight, the clay rising under his hands, the evening settling into the walls of the workshop the way evenings settle into places that have been worked in and lived in and held things together through difficulty, quietly, without announcement, as if it had always meant to stay.